The afternoon sun struck the pavement like a spotlight on a small, improbable scene. A Porsche pulled to the side, its gloss marred by a flat tire, and a young man with a stained canvas backpack squatted beside the rim, his hands already deep in a toolbox that looked older than the map of the town. The air smelled of hot rubber and coffee from a distant station, a metallic tang of oil on his fingers, and the faint sweetness of varnish from the wooden handle of his wrench. Theo Watson moved with a quiet competence, sleeves rolled, knuckles calloused, the muscle of his forearms familiar with resistance. Evelyn Carrington sat inside the car in a tailored coat, the sun catching the small studs at her collar, fingers hovering over a silenced phone. "You okay?" he said, voice steady like a practiced instruction. "Yes, I think so," she answered, voice light but tight around the edges. "I can change it," he offered, setting a jack with a soft thud. "My name is Evelyn," she said, almost surprised at how ordinary the introduction felt. "Theo," he replied, smiling without showing teeth. He refused the envelope she tried to hand him when he finished, pushing it back onto the seat as if returning a gesture that had been offered by reflex. She drove away with a strange weight in her chest, the city lights already assembling their small empire of messages and meetings. Later, alone in her car, she kept seeing his hands, the dark lines of grease, the way he had refused pay, as if the act itself were the point. Could a single spared moment be a beginning of something larger than either of them expected? The thought lodged in Evelyn the way an unexpected song can refuse to leave the head. Her penthouse smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper, a careful scent that masked the long meetings and the constant hum of obligations. She moved through rooms that showed the arc of her career, polished to a mirror-shine glass awards beside framed articles, a leather-bound phone directory with 1,000,000 names. She had given instructions for events until late, negotiated with board members, and signed a donation this morning with an almost automatic stroke. Yet when she closed her eyes, it was the scrape of Theo's wrench and the grit of roadside dust that replayed. She tasted the residue of tiredness and cotton candy from a charity gala she would attend that night, and felt the tautness in her jaw, like a rope pulled too tight. The memory of a young man who did not ask what she could offer, but who offered help without accounting, moved something in her. "Why do I keep thinking about him?" she whispered into the dark apartment, the question a small rebellion against a calendar that always won. The realization that she was hungry not for more influence, but for a form of unmediated human exchange unsettled her. Outside, the city, horns and footsteps, and the quiet clatter of someone closing a shop. She opened a drawer and found an old photograph of her mother at a community center, hands dusty with paint and eyes bright with an idea. And for the first time in months, Evelyn felt the tug of a calling she had shelved long ago. Over the next week, the image of Theo did not fade. Evelyn found herself driving back along the route, tracing the curve of that road as if it had become a map to an answer. She asked at a convenience store about a young man who fixed things and got 3 different descriptions, none with a last name. She asked her assistant Jenna Park to check property records and social feeds, and Jenna returned with a picture of a small storefront near the river with a chalk sign that read, "Woodwork and Repairs." Evelyn stepped into that place, and the smell hit her first. Sawdust and varnish and wet wood, with a hint of menthol from a small box of lozenges on the counter. Theo was there, sanding a bench with the slow patience of someone training a surface to speak. "You came back," he said when he looked up, surprised and cautious. "I wanted to thank you," she answered, voice smaller than it had been in meetings. "I did not fix it because I needed thanks," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Then let me help," she suggested, already imagining a donation, a plaque, an end to the vagueness she had felt. "Money is useful," he said, "but the people around here need something different, a place to learn. A bench that teaches someone how to use a plane is worth more than a check in my book." She laughed once, a short, curious sound, and the sound seemed to make something shift between them. Throughout that conversation, the shop rang with the small noises of craft, the rasp of a file, the ping of a hammer, the radio playing an old blues tune low in the background. There were also other voices in the day, neighbors calling names across yards, a volunteer dropping off wood, a garbage truck thudding in the street. "What would you do with support?" she asked. "Teach," Theo said simply. "We could run a workshop, show people how to make, how to fix, how to protect what they already have." "I can help with space and with startup funds," she said. "Then you would have to be willing to run it," he returned. The exchange lengthened, not with negotiations, but with small confidences that made each answer feel like a commitment being formed. Theo Watson grew up in a house with a porch that sagged, and a father who drove long-haul trucks and taught him how to coax order out of broken things. As a child, he learned to look for the logic under a noise, to identify a bearing the way some kids could name every constellation. He carried a mentor named Marcus Rivera in his memory, a retired carpenter who gave him the first plane and the first rule of the bench: do not rush the cut. In high school, he worked part-time at a bike shop, then at a furniture repair store, and he saved enough for a battered toolbox he wore like armor. He had been fired once from a temp job that wanted neat credentials and not the stubborn ingenuity he offered. He also lost his mother to an illness that hospitals treated with efficiency, but not with the warmth she needed. That loss lodged in him a conviction that practical skills are a form of dignity no diploma replaces. He believed that a community that knew how to fix a door or refinish a chair had resilience. Theo had built a small workshop in a rented garage and began offering free clinics for teenagers with restless hands and adults who had never been invited into a trade. He kept names in a notebook. Rosa Alvarez and Malik Osei and Lucy Bennett began as regulars and became helpers. He believed people deserved to learn, and he treated screws and splinters with equal seriousness because both could make a life work again. His backstory was in sawdust and unpaid overtime and small triumphs like a shelf that held a child's first book. Evelyn Carrington had been raised in a house where good manners were currency, and public work was a family tradition folded into banquets and boardrooms. Her father had been a lawyer, and her mother a volunteer who steered soup kitchens and art classes. In college, she learned to navigate networks and to craft proposals that opened locked doors. She excelled in the language of grants, on stage at conferences, comfortable among marble columns and sympathetic patrons. Success brought a penthouse and a name read in glossy magazines and invitations to curate philanthropic efforts. Yet beneath the varnished image, she carried the uneasy knowledge that many gifts were boxes opened and then stored away, that money without relationships can feel like a temporary fix. She had, in rare moments, missed the hands on the paint, the smell of glue, the roughness of an honest task. The loss of a mentor during her first major campaign taught her that influence can isolate and that leadership without listening can become a monologue. Her backstory included a scholarship that saved a semester, a brief marriage that ended in quiet estrangement, and a sense that legacy should mean something people could touch. She had the network to pour resources into any project, and the hunger to see those resources make a visible difference. When she met Theo, she recognized in him not a project to be funded, but a possible partner to translate intention into sustained work. They met properly for coffee in a small shop that smelled of espresso and lemon soap. The place was quiet, crowded with couches worn smooth and a barista who hummed under her breath. The conversation unfolded like a careful duet, the kind where each person learns how loud the other will sing. "How many people come to your clinics?" Evelyn asked. "Some weeks 6, sometimes 20, Theo replied. "What holds them?" she pushed, stirring her cup with a spoon. "Curiosity and the fact that tools do not judge you," he said and laughed. "Do you want to scale?" she asked, voice suddenly urgent with plans. "I do want more people to learn," he answered. "I am not sure I want to become an institution." Scaling can mean more reach and also more bureaucracy, she said. What if we built something that taught trades and taught dignity, he proposed. I have a space in mind and a roster of volunteers, he continued, listing names with the ease of someone reciting ingredients. I can call Malik and Rosa and Samir, he added. I can talk to Councilman Peter Lang about permits, she offered. The dialogue stretched and returned in quick exchanges, 8 times at least, each line revealing not only intent but temperament. Sensory notes filled the scene. The clink of ceramic on wood, the warmth of steam on skin, the rustle of a paper menu, the faint salt of city air that pressed through the window. They sketched a plan on a napkin, the ink blotting at places as if the idea were trying to find a stable shape. "What do you need now?" she asked. "A real bench and a schedule," he replied. "And volunteers," she added. "And trust," he said simply. The coffee shop faded around them, and the pact they formed began to feel like a small gravity. The first public test arrived sooner than either expected. Evelyn had been invited to speak at a gala that crowned a year of corporate donations. She agreed to mention the workshop as a new initiative and expected polite applause and a line item in the program. Instead, she was confronted by a group skeptical of her motives and of outsiders with checks who implemented projects without listening. The room smelled of expensive perfume and lemon polish and the clink of crystal. A board member named Henrietta Cole leaned close to a reporter and said, "Is this another vanity play?" in a tone meant to carry. Another guest, an influential donor named Peter Wu, raised a brow and muttered that foundations needed metrics, not feel-good stories. The crowd held a thin applause for Evelyn's speech, and somewhere in the second row, someone laughed like a valve releasing pressure. The conversation boiled into whispers about inequality and authenticity. She felt eyes measuring his worth the way a scale measures gold. Theo attended too, out of loyalty and curiosity, and he felt the same heat, a different kind from the glow of saws. A woman at a nearby table, Jenna Park, told a guest that the initiative needed to show numbers before it deserved attention. Marcus Rivera, now volunteering, sat in a booth making no comment. The tension gathered like static in the air as Evelyn tried to explain a hands-on approach to a room that preferred reports and glossy outcomes. "You cannot simply parachute in," someone said loudly, and the sentence landed like a pebble into a shallow pool, creating ripples of doubt. Theo heard the undertone of condescension and felt a small flush rise in his neck. The moment forced both of them to confront perceptions and the unspoken hierarchy that shaped the room's acceptance. This conflict played out in words, but it hurt like a physical bruise to pride and intention. The humiliation was not just for one night. It expanded into an obstacle that would define them. In the following days, flyers asking whose workshop it was popped up in message threads. Social media commentary questioned a wealthy donor's real commitment. And a local television segment framed the initiative as yet another case of rich people solving poor problems. Evelyn received curt emails from board members and calls from donors who wanted guarantees. Theo faced sneers from a contractor who implied he was asking for charity instead of offering work. The town council meeting grew crowded with voices. The tension rippled out to Rosa and Malik, who worried for the reputation of the small group of volunteers. For 2 nights they barely spoke, and then met at the workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil comfortingly neutral. "I am tired of being the example for people to pat," Theo said, voice low. "We are not a show," Evelyn answered, hands pressed to her temples. "What if we change the way we present it?" suggested Malik, who had learned to read an audience in community meetings. "We can open the doors before the gala and invite people to see the work," Rosa said. The solution required them to act, not to perform, and to build trust with neighbors who had a reason to be skeptical. This period of strained courage lasted long enough to test the edges of their resolve and short enough to allow a pivot that would reveal the project's true character. The public sting hardened their purpose or broke it. The choice demanded visible, immediate work. They repaired their fragile alliance in the workshop itself, a place that smelled of cedar and oil and the hot, steady halo of bulbs. Theo apologized in a quiet way by offering Evelyn a planer and showing her how to feel the grain. "I did not mean to speak for everyone," he said, while his hands guided hers along a strip of maple. "You do not have to apologize," she answered, surprised at how vulnerable the bench could make her. "I do not want applause. I want this to last." The scene unfolded over a long conversation, 8 to 10 exchanges in which they confessed small failures and small hopes. Theo revealed the names of families he wanted to reach and the particular fear that his students would not be believed. Evelyn opened up about the emptiness boardrooms sometimes left and how she wanted a legacy that was tactile and repairable. "What if we start with a free class for single parents?" Theo proposed. "We can show outcomes in ways that matter to people," Evelyn said, thinking through calendars of courses and childcare. "I will help secure a grant, but you will design the curriculum," she insisted. "And you will not micromanage the shop," he countered, half-teasingly. They wrote down a plan on a creased notebook, pages curling with fingerprints like a map. Around them the workshop hummed with activity. Rosa varnishing a table, Malik sharpening chisels, Samir Khan painting signs, Lucy Bennett sweeping chips into a neat pile, and Marcus Rivera mentoring a teenager who could not stop smiling. The reconciliation felt less like a closure and more like a promise signed in dust. Planning became labor. They converted an old municipal garage into a community workshop, cleaned out decades of accumulated junk, painted a wall with a color Theo called honest blue, and Evelyn insisted suggested a neutral beige, until she tried the blue and admitted it felt right. The process required permits, conversations with Councilman Peter Lang, and clearance from the local health office, with Dr. Priya Nair advising on safety. They cataloged tools and negotiated donations from a lumber yard and a hardware store owner named Samir Khan, who offered a discount if they promised to teach apprentices. Jenna Park organized volunteers and publicity, while Marcus helped train new mentors. The work scenes were full of sensory detail: the rasp of belts, the shudder of drills, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the taste of strong coffee handed in paper cups, the feel of calloused palms smoothing a board. Dialogues in these sequences were frequent, with many short exchanges as plans were adjusted and problems solved. Theo taught students how to measure twice and cut once, the phrase repeating like a small ritual. They also explained a simple process for setting up a safety protocol: check guards on machines, clear floor of debris, provide eye protection and gloves, and a brief orientation for each new volunteer. The technical explanation was short and plain. Each machine had a designated trainer who tested competency on simple tasks. Paperwork tracked hours and outcomes, and a small fund covered consumables. The practical description made the invisible work visible and put structure under goodwill. The public conference that would reveal the project to the city was a crucible. They prepared a presentation that combined numbers with testimony. Evelyn wrote a speech that spoke of dignity and hands learning, and Theo arranged for 3 students to demonstrate a simple restoration live on stage. The night arrived with a packed hall and a press table close enough to feel the flash of cameras as small bursts of white. Evelyn stepped up and started with a confession. That she had once thought money could fix the world and had learned instead that relationships were the scaffolding of change. "This is not about charity," she declared. "This is about building skill and pride and a practical legacy." Theo followed and introduced Vera, a single mother who had learned to refinish chairs and found a part-time job through the network. The audience watched a live demo and then a Q&A that turned from hostile to curious. Letters started to appear in the inbox, and a skeptical reporter changed the tone of an article after meeting the students in the workshop and hearing their plans. The tide turned slowly and then with a visible momentum. Yet the climax also included a setback. A late donor withdrew support, citing budget cuts, and a permit review delayed an expansion. The community reaction split into supportive messages and sharp critiques, but the volunteers did not retreat. The moment of revelation was messy and human, and it tested their resolve in public. One of the most intense moments came when conservative commentators accused the initiative of being a vanity project. The words cut into Evelyn in the way a blunt tool does. They left a bruise under a public smile. 2 paragraphs of tension detailed the confrontation and the fallout. The first paragraph showed the amplified voice of social media and small talk translating into bigger doubts and a delayed check that threatened payroll. The second paragraph described the small team in a meeting, staring at numbers, the heat of exhaustion, the small heroic acts, like Marcus offering to cover a week of snacks, and Rosa agreeing to host an extra class. The episode forced them to clarify their governance and bring in independent advisors to review budgets and outcomes. They invited Dr. Priya Nair to assess safety and a community panel to recommend accountability measures. The tension did not vanish, but it became a lever for transparency. The crisis taught them to build structures that matched their intentions. The grand opening came on a damp morning with banners still wet and the smell of coffee and frying dough from a nearby bakery making the air feel like comfort. The ribbon was replaced with a simple wooden plaque and a free demonstration to the neighborhood. Families arrived, council members like Peter Lang showed up, along with volunteers like Jenna Park and Samir Khan, and students carried finished items to a small table under a canopy. Evelyn gave a short speech that did not try to frame everything as perfect but invited participation. Theo stood beside her with his hands still rough from sanding and said, "This is yours too." The plate read Community Workshop and Learning Center and looked modest and honest. The inauguration was not an ending, but the beginning of scheduled classes and apprenticeships. The numbers were small at first, 25 attendees in the first month and a dozen volunteers committed. The presence of named characters kept the scene. Grounded Marcus Rivera, mentor; Rosa Alvarez, coordinator; Malik Osei, outreach; Lucy Bennett, bookkeeping; Samir Khan, supply liaison; Jenna Park, communications; and Councilman Peter Lang offering a brief speech, all anchored the project in real people. The reactions were mixed, but leaned toward hope. A neighbor named Carla from the bakery cried openly and hugged Theo and Evelyn, which felt like the kind of approval that mattered because it came from daily life rather than glossy pages. 1 month later, the workshop had settled into a rhythm. Enrollment lists showed 40 participants, including single parents and retirees. Theo taught basic joinery 2 days a week, and Marcus led a youth apprenticeship program 3 afternoons. Evelyn had secured a small grant, but more importantly, spent weekends in the shop alongside volunteers, learning to plane and to sand, and slowly to accept not directing every move. The smell of sawdust had become a familiar marker of progress, and the ledger showed honest accounting with small donations from local businesses coordinated by Samir Khan. Rosa ran a free childcare rotation, and Malik organized a bus to pick up students from a nearby neighborhood. The community began to refer to the space as simply the bench, an odd, affectionate shorthand that made volunteers laugh. A local teacher named Lucy Bennett used the workshop to run an after-school club, and a neighborhood newspaper printed a feature titled, "From Little Things Come Sturdy Tables." They measured success in simple, concrete ways. One mother, Vera, completed a certificate and found part-time employment restoring furniture. Attendance lists and new volunteers grew, and people began to leave notes of thanks on a corkboard near the tool wall. There remained skeptics and administrative hurdles, but the most important change was cultural, a sense that craftsmanship and dignity could be taught and could be a source of income and pride. 3 months later, the program had expanded offerings and deepened partnerships. Dr. Priya Nair ran a safety certification, and an accredited community college agreed to provide a pathway for apprentices to formalize their skills. The council had approved a small matching grant after seeing the data and testimonials provided by the community panel. A local contractor named Peter Wu, who had once been skeptical, now offered a modest contract to restore doors in a city building, giving paid work to graduates. The workshop had trained 80 people in 3 months and had a waiting list for evening classes. Theo had become a paid coordinator and Marcus a stipend mentor. Volunteers like Jenna Park and Samir Khan organized fundraising events that were practical and tied to skills demonstrations rather than gala dinners. There were stories. A teenager named Amir who joined to avoid an unsteady street life and discovered he liked making birdhouses so much he began a side business. a group of seniors restoring chairs as therapy, and a partnership with a vocational program that promised credits. The community's response was cautiously optimistic, and the critique had shifted from the motive of a single donor to the quality of outcomes and the project's promise of steady work and learning. 6 months later, the workshop had a small satellite site in a neighboring district and an annual schedule of courses. The community center reported that over 200 people had used the space for classes, repair cafes, and mentorship. Evelyn and Theo had formalized a council of advisors, including Marcus Rivera and Dr. Priya Nair, and local educators Lucy Bennett and Maliko Say, to ensure governance reflected community voices. The project had attracted modest press, but more importantly, had a payroll line that supported 2 part-time coordinators and a budget for materials. A permanent tool library was cataloged and labeled, and volunteers tracked hours in a shared ledger. A public school partnership allowed teenagers to earn credit, and the first apprentice cohort of 10 had placements in local shops. The tangible legacy was visible in repaired furniture, community-built benches in parks, and a series of letters families wrote to the workshop thanking them for practical training that turned into employment. Evelyn found herself learning to let go of theatrical gestures and preferring the slow accumulation of everyday work. Theo discovered that occasional speeches did not reduce his credibility, but that managing a growing program required paperwork he had once resisted. He learned the language of grants and accountability without losing the stubborn soul of the bench. The final scene held a small inauguration of a community fair, with children hammering small nail into donated wood, elders teaching techniques, and a sense that hands and plans could make something lasting. At the end, they both said a few words that felt like closure and like an invitation. Theo looked at the bench they had built together and said, "We mended more than furniture here." Evelyn touched her palm to the grain and answered, "We built something people can touch and pass on." The project remained imperfect and alive, a practice, not a product. If this story made you think about the power of small acts and the dignity of working with your hands, subscribe to follow more stories where ordinary meetings become the root of community change.